The Shakhtarksyi district, which is the cornerstone of the Ukrainian defenses in the southern parts of Pokrovsk, is actively collapsing as the Russians are storming one part of it after another, gaining full control over the northern and northeastern outskirts of it, leaving just the western parts remaining under Ukrainian control. The Russians have managed to make significant gains in the area, and this decisive outpost that holds the entire defense of the southern parts of the city, as well as the gateway to the eastern parts of it, is almost entirely under Russian control. This is a decisive development for the battle over the city. The Russians have managed to advance not just in the southern parts of Pokrovsk, but also on the northern flank, regaining control over parts of Nikhanorivka on the northern flank of Pokrovsk, as well as in the direction of Shakhove, managing to kick out the Ukrainians from the residential area here to the north of the city. With additional advances in the vicinity of Liman on the northern and northeastern flanks, the Russians have managed to gain control over the fortifications to the northwest of Sarishne and the fortifications north of Stavki. The Russians are almost entirely full control over the road from Stavki in the north to Sarishne in the east, which would physically encircle the Ukrainian positions in Mirne and along the Sherebets river line, which remains under their control, and to connect the supplies from Sarishne to Stavki, which significantly shortens the supply line for the Russian forces. The current supply lines to the Stavki direction is from Kreminna through the highway up towards Makiivka, or through secondary roads from Zherenovivka along towards Ivanivka, through the Sherebets river line up towards Kolodyasy, and then down towards Stavki, or through the Makiivka road towards Nove, and then down towards Stavki. This means these are very wide supply lines, while the road from Kreminna towards Sarishne will then connect to Stavki in the north, which significantly shortens and gives a much more stable road for the Russian forces towards Liman. Taking a look at it, we can see the Russians have managed to gain control over the fortifications here in the western outskirts of the northern parts of Sarishne, following the full capture of Sarishne by the Russian forces, which leaves a narrow gap for the Ukrainian forces to resupply the forces within Mirne, where the Russians have direct fire control over the remaining road. The Ukrainians do not have any roads themselves, as the only dirt road is now under physical control by the Russians. Instead, they have to pass through the open fields to reach the anti-tank ditch line. The trenches are here on the northern flank of Sarishne, while no trenches along the road itself remains under Ukrainian control. Russians have gained full control over all of the trenches, all towards Stavki. The capture of the trenches to the north of Stavki also allows Russians to now establish a position where they can storm Stavki itself, gaining control over which is the last outpost for the Ukrainian defenses north of Liman. This means gaining control over it will not just allow the Russians to connect their forces from Starishne to Stavki, but also allows the Russians to gain full control over the first line of defense all the way to Dobrisheve, with the recent advance here to the south of the Rilove, opening the road for offensive operations towards Dobrisheve as well. This means the Russians will be looking to gain control over Stavki and Dobrisheve, which will allow them to cut off the northwestern supply line, have a supply line to the north and to the east that connects towards Liman, and to support the offensive operations going towards the city, all of which significantly bolsters the Russian offensive capabilities in the area. Moving to the south in the direction of the northern flank of Pokrovsk, the Russians made a small advance here to the west of Shakhove as they push in the direction of the fortifications west of the settlement to reach the entry into the settlement from the western flank. This is to threaten the Ukrainian positions in the direction of Volodymyrivka by gaining control over the high ground on the western bank of the river line, and to cut the supplies within Shakhove going down towards Volodymyrivka to support the offensive operations going towards the town from the south following the recapture of Novotoretsk. At the same time, the Russian recapture of Nikhanorivka allows them to completely kick out the Ukrainians from the residential area. Although the Ukrainians managed to recapture Doroshne, their supplies to the forces operating south of Nikhanorivka have yet again been cut off with Russian recapture of the residential area, forcing the Ukrainians to move through the forest patch areas, which leaves only an open space for a small concentration of Ukrainian forces remaining under their control, which significantly bolsters the Russian defensive capabilities and significantly weakens the Ukrainian offensive capabilities to the west of Boykivka, allowing the Russians to launch an operation to regain control over the eastern parts of the defensive lines here near Doroshne. Combined with the recent recapture of the Ukrainian positions here in the direction of Vilna in the north, the Russians are not just securing the supply lines for the northern operations, but are also outflanking the Ukrainian positions by attacking them from the southern and northern flanks, which will allow them to regain control over Novoshakhova, Ivanivka, and Doroshne, and develop offensive operations in the western direction towards Dobropilya, or strengthen and double down on defensive capabilities for the offensive operations in the northeastern and northwestern directions, expanding their zone of control and offensive operations to reach and cut off the road between Dobropilya here in the southwest and Kramatorsk in the northeast. As for Pokrovsk itself, the recent Russian advances within the Shakhtarksyi district not just gains control over the northeastern and northern outskirts of the Shakhtarksyi district, including several schools, apartment complex buildings, government offices, and so on, which are all buildings that are well reinforced naturally through the heavy concrete buildings that they built in Ukraine. This allows the Russians to have high-rise buildings that overlooks the eastern parts of the city, allowing the Russians a vantage point for further offensive operations within the city, but also completely secures the southern flank for Russian supply lines going into the city from the south with this highway that connects directly to Shevchenko and further south towards Novotroitske and through the railway area down towards Selidove. This means that the logistics of the Russian forces operating within Pokrovsk has been significantly strengthened, not to mention the additional supply routes that go through Pyshane, Sverove, and Leontovichi. As we can see, there was a clear objective with the Ukrainian counterattacks in the direction of Pyshane and Shevchenko half a year ago, where the Ukrainians were attempting to regain control over both of these settlements, as they are key settlements which allowed the Russians to develop offensive operations in the direction of Pokrovsk from the south, with control over Shevchenko and Pyshane, and now the majority of the Shakhtarksyi district, Sverove, Leontovichi, and Troyanda, the Russians have several supply lines into the city from the south, which allows them to have a much larger concentration of forces. With full control over the Shakhtarksyi district, the Russians will not only have stable supply lines leading into the city, but they will also have a place to concentrate their forces within. This will allow the Russians to develop significantly and powerfully their offensive operations within the southern parts of the city into the central apartment complex area, which then extends into the central parts along the railway area and allowing them to cut off the main highway in the northern parts of the city, which will then limit the supplies going into Mirnorod. If it is combined with additional pushes in the direction of Rodinsky in the northern flank to cut off the northern highway, the Russians can achieve a complete encirclement over Mirnorod by gaining full control over Pokrovsk and Rodinsky. Therefore, with these recent developments, the Russian capture of the Shakhtarksyi district does not just mean a significant logistical hub being under their control, very well fortified position, as well as supply lines leading into the city being under their control and increasing their combat capabilities. It also opens up for a road for a complete encirclement of Mirnorod and the surrounding settlements and fortifications, which will buy the Russians a lot of time they would have otherwise used to storm the city of Mirnorod and the surrounding settlements. Instead, the Russians will be focusing on defense on the eastern flank and on the northern flank, on offense towards Rodinsky and the central parts of Pokrovsk to cut off their main supply routes into Mirnorod, completely encircling the city and forcing a withdrawal from Mirnorod, or the Ukrainians will risk a complete encirclement, similar to the developments in the Kupiansk direction. The activities we're seeing in the direction of Pokrovsk, Mirnorod, and Kupiansk here at the start of October, not to mention the recent developments in the Liman and Siversk directions as well, it is clear that the Ukrainian positions are slowly deteriorating throughout the front line, where the main defensive capabilities of the Ukrainians within the Sloviansk-Stentinivka line are holding. All of the flanks to this, Pokrovsk, Siversk, Liman, and Kupiansk in the north, are all collapsing bit by bit. With the collapse of the Shakhtarksyi district in the south of Pokrovsk, it is only a matter of time before the Russians completely establish themselves within the city and gain full control of it, as we saw in the Kupiansk direction. Once the Russians gained a foothold within the city and properly established themselves within residential buildings that are of the apartment complex type, they were able to quickly encircle the Ukrainian forces within the city and push through the central parts to now have the complete upper hand within it. We are seeing the same trend developing within Pokrovsk, which is a much larger city and the main logistical hub for the Ukrainian forces in the western parts of the city, and it's also one of the main supply lines for the Sloviansk-Konstantinivka line from the western direction. If the same developments happen within Liman and Siversk, the Russians will have control over the high ground overlooking the Sloviansk-Konstantinivka line from the east, and have fire control over the Izium road to the northwest, which is one of the main supply lines to the Sloviansk-Konstantinivka line now that Pokrovsk is under siege. In conclusion, we are seeing significant developments taking place within the Donetsk region here in the start of the month of October. If the current trend continues, it's only a matter of time before the Russians gain control over Pokrovsk, Siversk, Liman, and Kupiansk, which will begin the beginning of the end of the Donetsk region, as beyond Pokrovsk, Liman, and Siversk within Donetsk, there is only a siege of the Sloviansk-Konstantinivka line. As for full control over the four regions by the end of 2025, it is increasingly completely unlikely, as the Russians are not even projected to gain full control over the Donetsk region by the end of this year. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.